One of my favorite things about my YouTube channel is the interaction. Despite there being a very high flow of messages, sometimes 400 or 500 a day, I actually do try and read them all. I respond to many of them every day. Some people think I'm a team. I'm not. I have a couple of friends who edit some of the videos, by all means not all of them, but they do a great job when they do. The scripts, the research, the making of the video, sometimes the editing of the video, all the posting on YouTube, TikTok, Substack, they're all 100% done by me. I know a lot of vloggers don't read and they don't respond to comments. Maybe they just don't have the time, but I like to make the time. The comments often inspire me to be better. They give me ideas, and from time to time, but rarely, they show me which rude people should be removed from the channel. My video about the Taliban last week was a great one for some fantastic comments. Some good, some not so good, and some a little disconcerting. I selected a few to make another video from there. Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes, not on China, but again, this is my take on some of the things you said about Afghanistan, or the Taliban. Someone called Selenian8188 quite rightly pointed out that the Taliban destroyed centuries-old Buddhist statues, and that can't be glossed over. I remember when that happened, and my reply was, agreed. That was, in our opinion, quite an evil thing to do. But didn't Moses also come off the mountain and destroy false gods? So if you believe completely in your God, then maybe following the Bible or the Quran or whatever you follow and destroying false idols is something you might also do. I don't know the background to this story. I do know it happened, and when it happened, I felt the same. I certainly didn't approve of it, but I do now understand it. Take a look at the UK and the US, where old statues are being or have been destroyed or vandalized because we no longer like the history associated with them. In the US, it's the Civil War. In the UK, it's slavery. Is there really a difference? We destroy our old culture too? It's not an excuse, but perhaps instead of judging them for that, we should ask them why they did it so we could understand their reasons a little better. And then when I said maybe the Taliban aren't all bad, this follower, whose name I'm not going to attempt, said, how about the people falling from the sky when the US withdrew? Now, I assume this was an indication that at least some people in Afghanistan at that time thought they were pretty bad. And my reply to this was, the same thing happens every time there's a war, especially a war inside one country when the losers leave. Those people who've worked with them, for them, or been informants of them, will be deemed to have betrayed their own country. They'll do everything they can to avoid the repercussions of that. The very same thing happened in Saigon, in Cuba, in the USA even in 1776. This is historically proven. It's not fear of the Taliban. It's a fear of reprisals from the winners. How many executions, tortures, or renditions have we heard about since the Taliban took over? All I'm hearing in the media and seeing is reports that they're evil, with no evidence that they actually are. I'm seeing stability, education returning, including to women, and I've seen the eradication of an evil drug by this supposedly evil regime. It doesn't stack up. But for sure, many people who were being paid by the US and promised a US victory for so long would be desperate to leave. I wouldn't blame the Taliban for that. I'd blame the US. Shen Productions said, if there's Sharia law in Afghanistan, then it's not good. Well, my answer is simple. Why not? If the answer is because you don't like it, then maybe we could go to Afghanistan and ask the Afghans who live there. They live under it, whether they like it, whether they want it or not. If they don't, then I agree with you, it's bad. But if the majority of them do, then what does it matter to us how they choose to live? This is their culture. Vanessa Jakes asked why the outlets spreading fake news and never shut down. What a great question. It's because they are the public relations arm of the organizations that set out to misinform us. The US and the Brits have been doing it successfully for years, generations in fact, but social media has exposed them. Here's the most worrying thing. They won't be shut down. The voices that expose them will be shut down. Think of Assange and Snowden, almost all whistleblowers. Look at how anti-China vloggers have 1 million followers, and people like me, despite being proven right time and time again, get suppressed and constantly see followers being unsubscribed. Some might say that's all part of a conspiracy theory, but in fact, it looks very real once you start seeing it. The next one appeared to be really anti-Taliban. It said, they give people the choice, accept it or die. I don't believe that's true. I'm sure 90% of Afghans live perfectly normal lives without the threat of imminent death hanging over them. They even have festivals and holidays there. I wonder if the Taliban do behead people in the public square. I've never heard of it. I'm not saying they don't. But if they do, it's no different to what we did in very recent history. Executions were legal, even kings and queens. The French got really good at it and did hundreds, maybe thousands. The Brits, not much less better than that. They had a lot of public executions, so did the Americans. They're only a couple of 100 years old. Let's not impose our modern Western values on a traditional country, and let's not try to change them by force, but by education, modernization. And remember, under Western US-led standards, everyone who isn't white Anglo-Saxon is deemed to need changing to their ways with guns or bombs. And these shouldn't be needed to deliver freedom and democracy. Vaska thinks the Taliban banned music, kite flying, and education for girls. Who told you they did all these things, Vaska? Mainstream media? I personally know for a fact that kite flying is still a sport. Google this. Afghanistan Kite Festival marks a year since the Taliban takeover. It'll take you to a report on the BBC. There were 16 cities celebrating this festival in 2022. I'm not sure I've ever seen a report of an actual stoning in Afghanistan. I've heard of them in Western media, but I've never seen any evidence that one took place, only that they do happen. I wonder why in this day and age of mobile phone cameras we've never seen one online. And the last point that was addressed in this initial video, girls are getting educated and Westerners are being misinformed about it. Someone called Chinaman had a point. The Taliban got screwed because they refused to hand over bin Laden. No, not really. This is again a Western media-influenced, misinformed view. I understand why you have it or other people have it, but what Western media didn't tell us was that when the US asked for bin Laden to be handed over, the Taliban asked for the evidence. The CBS News has a report on this. I've linked it in a quote from the Taliban ambassador back in 2001. Quote, our position on this is that if America has proof, we are ready for the trial of Osama bin Laden in light of the evidence. End of quote. Furthermore, there is no extradition agreement between Afghanistan and the US, so the US had no right to impose their will on a sovereign nation, and the sovereign nation had every right to consider the request and reject it on the basis of the evidence provided. When it wasn't forthcoming, the Taliban said no. That's absolutely fair enough. Now imagine if China went to the USA and said, we want those Uyghur terrorist separatists that you are protecting and employing in Washington. What would the US say to China? USA's request for Afghanistan to hand over bin Laden was supported by the UN, but has since been deemed not a legal request as it denied due process. Therefore, the invasion to get him was an illegal invasion and a sustained occupation, illegally, of Afghanistan by the United States. Real Kevin Chan pointed out that the US turned a blind eye to the opium industry. Well, my response to this was, I don't think they turned a blind eye. I think they were the proponents of the industry. They facilitated it. They provided a market. No one could grow something they couldn't sell. No one would. Which means someone was buying it. Who was buying it? And how much of it ended up in the USA during a war? For the record now that the largest supplier, Afghanistan, has closed down, it's interesting to see that the second largest has picked up the slack. It's Myanmar. And guess what's happening there right now? A civil war to overthrow a, quote, democratically elected government which the US invested $1.5 billion into. Coincidence? Perhaps. Timothy Crane made a great point that they canned this year's crop but kept last year's crop in storage so they could make a profit and recovery, which was not entirely correct, but there certainly was some storage of last year's crop. However, there is a large medical and legitimate market for opium too. I read that they retained a very small crop for that purpose. I guess a lot depends on where we get our news from. If it's legitimate and medical, then what's the problem? China and India will purchase it and create legitimate medicines from it. The inference from this comment is that they'll recover all the losses, but it's 1 year's supply. It's not a long-term solution. They won't recover next year. Now, in finishing my topic of Afghanistan, I'd like to ask you all a question. What is it that makes us Westerners think we can or even should try to change thousands of years of local culture in less than a generation? Afghanistan will either change or it won't. But if it's changing, it shouldn't be because we want it to change. It should be because they want it to change. If we work with them without imposing our values, our traditions, our culture, or our ideology, or even religious beliefs on them, I'm willing to bet there will be a slow generational change for the better for them, not necessarily for us. What they want is far more important than what we want for them. Thanks once again for watching this rather long one. Please don't forget to check your subscribe buttons. As I mentioned before, we are getting some people cut off. And like, share, all the usual. And please feel free to comment. I will read them and hopefully get back to you and sometimes make a video from your comment. See you next time.